Welcome, everyone. We're back talking about race again. MVP went on CT Fletcher's F Y'all podcast to discuss race and wrestling. He made some interesting comments that I want to sort of debunk. The first is going to be about representation as he, pushes back a little bit on what Lashley said a couple of months ago about just being a champion and not being a black champion. So that's going to be the first clip we're going to play. The second is going to be about race playing a factor in the WWE Championship, which is going to lead to me actually going through a bunch of black wrestlers, seeing if they should have been black WWE champions. And I think that once we get done with this, we ought to have a really good idea. This, of course, doesn't mean I'm not a fan of MVP. I really am. I'm a huge fan. I think that MVP is a blessed man. Somebody with his background making it in wrestling is not likely. What I mean by his background, I mean, his criminal record. The same thing with him and Booker T. You talk about two guys who got a second chance at life to basically start over from scratch after pretty much screwing up their teenage years. It's kind of hard to take a lot of the criticisms that these guys, levy seriously, because people who don't have like armed robberies on their jacket don't get opportunities, but these guys did. So I just wanted to make sure that that's put out there. I was a fan of MVP. I still am, but I don't agree with everything he says. So we're going to talk about the representation argument first, because I think this one is, I don't like the representation argument, but we're gonna play along, and then I'm going to sort of debunk some of it. So let's see what we can do here, if I can get the audio to play correctly.
You ever think we will get to a time where being a black champion will just be a normal thing to see? And when we have one, it doesn't have to be, he's a black champion. We just be seen as an actual champion.
All right, before he answers that question, I think that it could be that way today if we stop putting so much emphasis on it. I think that there's been enough black champions, and it's not a whole lot. Clearly, it could be more, but if you have the talent, then people won't look at you as a black champion. They'll look at you as just a champion.
So I understand Bobby's philosophy about normalizing champions and taking the race or ethnicity out of it. However, I also understand that representation matters. Growing up, I didn't have any black action heroes. There weren't black G.I. Joes. We didn't have that. It means something to be able to look up and see a champion that looks like you. And everybody, especially at this current time in our society with all the division regarding, race and political ideology, I still believe that it does mean something, especially for black men, to have black role models and to have black heroes that you can look up to and identify with, people who can identify with your plight, your story, your struggle. So yeah, I'd love to get to a point where we can just normalize champions, but to me, that aspect of having representation, somebody to look up to that does look like you, that will always be important.
You ever think we will?
All right, so let's start with where MVP and I agree. I do believe it is very important for young people to have role models, and I do believe it's very important especially for young black boys, to have pretty good role models. I think that the role models that young black boys have had since the 80s have been deleterious to the black experience, because it's been mostly thugs, rappers, and drug dealers, which is, not a positive. That being said, here's where we're going to diverge. MVP said that there were no black action heroes when he was a kid. MVP was born in 1973. There were 3 Shaft movies before he was even born. So Shaft already existed before he was even born. Fred Williamson, who played Black Caesar, his first movie was in 1972. He was still making movies well into the 1980s, and these were movies that he was funding himself. because he had lost sort of the Hollywood backing. So he spent almost the entire 70s making action movies with himself as the star. Not like Richard Roundtree, who, let's be honest, Shaft was created by a Jew. All right? So Richard Roundtree was making his own movie. Not Richard Roundtree, I'm sorry. Fred Williamson was making his own movies with himself as the star. He was funding these movies himself, probably with debt, but he was funding the movies himself. And this is when MVP was just a baby. He was just a babe at this point in time. Well, Jim Brown, football star Jim Brown. His first movie was in 1964. Almost 10 years before MVP was even born. He was still starring in movies well into the 2000s. Jim Kelly, noted one of my favorites, by the way. His first movie was in the early 1970s, 1972. He was Black Belt Jones in 1974. He was still making movies before he died, and he died in like 2013 or something like that. He was still making movies. Mr. T was the star of the A-Team. This came out in 1983, which means that MVP would have been old enough to see it on TV. He would have been 10 years old when the A-Team came out. So he says he had no black action heroes. What do you mean? Let's say he would not have seen Jim Kelly and Fred Williamson because there was no VCRs. Maybe he was too poor to have a VCR at that time. Guess what? Mr. T would have been beamed through his television if he had NBC, which he did. Because I know I had it. And I'm 10 years younger than him. So I know he had it. So then you have that. You have Mr. T. Then you had Carl Weathers. His first movie was in 1973. Action Jackson, which was, one of his few starring roles, 1988. Which means MVP would have been 15 years old. And let's get petty with it. I even decided to get more petty. The first black G.I. Joe was in 1984. MVP would have been 11. He would have been old enough to play with G.I. Joe still, kind of. Depending on, certain 11-year-olds. They might not have been playing with G.I. Joes, but there was a G.I. Joes in 1984. A black one. Roadblock. Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson played him in a movie. If you say, well, we didn't have any movie roles, we didn't have any action stars when we was coming up, that would have made sense if he was born in like the 40s. If he was like as old as my dad, then maybe. Because my dad was like a teenager when all this Shaft stuff was happening. My dad was born in like 1960. My mom was born in 68, so my dad was probably born in 65. There weren't a lot of black actors at all at that point in time, let alone action stars. But if you were born in, so his generation got to see all of these guys, which in turn put me up on all these guys. That's why I know so much about the blaxploitation era of Hollywood. And speaking of which, before anybody starts talking about representation on TV and all this kind of stuff, the blaxploitation of Hollywood was the 60s and the 70s. You saw a lot of black people making their own movies, and a lot of it was funded and written by white folks. I mean, yes, it's true. But, the people who made a lot of black actors really a lot of money was during this time. And then after them, you had Spike Lee, which was like the mid 80s to the early 2010s. And then, of course, Tyler Perry from like 2000 to today. So you've always had black people on television throughout my entire life. So my experience is a little bit different from MVP's. Because I understand he might have been, by the time he really was understanding the world, there might not have been a lot of black people on TV. But if you talk about what's happening, you talk about Sanford and Son, you talk about all these things that I watched in reruns as a kid, he probably got to see first run. And if I remember that stuff, he has to remember it. So, while I do understand that they need to be black role models, and I do respect that, I don't like the we don't have, because it erases so many people that I know exist. And even if you say, well, look, all these movies came out before his formative years. You know, but maybe he didn't have a VCR. Maybe he could. Like, a lot of these things were run on TV. Like, I used to see Jackie Chan movies on television when I was a kid. I didn't live in like China or nothing like that. They were just running them on the middle of the day on TV. So I know that these things existed. All right. So we got that out here. So let's talk about the WWE Championship, where he's going to have this criticism of
champion.
the booking of the WWE title.
Prior to The Rock winning the WWE Championship, there were no champions. We had Pedro Morales.
Yeah.
So you had a Puerto Rican champion. So in the history of the company, nobody was good enough. You didn't have one black dude come through that was good enough to be champion. And then The Rock came. And then you didn't have any for a long time. And then Booker came. But Booker had the World Championship. He had that WWE Championship. And did I say too much already, man? Should I? There are certain things that are very evident.
Yeah.
And, you know, I'm glad that there has come a time when, like he said, you can rattle off a bunch of names that were black men who held that title. And that makes me very happy. I'm glad to see that progress. But, you know, there are certain things that are just blatantly obvious, you know. And some people, come on, you want to make everything about race. Because it is, motherfucker. Because it is.
All right, let's start where we might agree. I think ultimately a lot of territories and the WWE and WCW to a degree, even though WCW basically ran in the South, they did a poor job recruiting and training black talent. I think there was a very poor job done. But I recognize that failure of the entire business. The entire business failed, you know, I guess you could say black people in that regard, by not having a lot of, you know, top black talent out there. So I agree. You know, that was a big issue. That's a big problem. That's a step. I'm willing to go a step further than MVP. But let's talk about the WWE Championship. Let's basically start not with Vince Sr., but the WWE Championship in general. The WWE title was, before Bob Backlund, it was held mostly by what they call an ethnic babyface. You know, so you had Raka. You know, you had who was the top guy for a long time. And then you had Bruno, you know, for the Italians. And Pedro Morales for the Puerto Ricans. Now, they will say Bruno doesn't count because Italians are white. You know, they may say, and Bob Backlund, he doesn't really count either. He's just generic white guy, right? And Hulk Hogan, I guess, was also supposed to be supposedly ethnic. That's why they went with the name Hogan. They wanted to kind of come up with the Irish thing, even though Terry Bollea himself is Italian. It doesn't make sense, but whatever. Let's talk about some of the black talent that came through there during the Vince McMahon, the junior era. So you got two top black guys right here, Tony Atlas and Rocky Johnson. They were the first black WWF tag team champions. Well, Tony Atlas notably had a drug issue. And he was actually pegged at one point to be the Intercontinental Champion, and he kind of screwed it up. Rocky Johnson is kind of... I couldn't find anything that says, you know, why he wouldn't have gotten the push. Outside of maybe just didn't work out. But you have the first black tag team champions. And both would have been nice. And I think Tony Atlas was probably the favorite of the two, as far as I know in the story. But Tony Atlas, you know, kind of screwed himself out of a job. From there, you really didn't have another major black talent in the WWF until the Junkyard Dog, who famously had drug issues even going back to his time in Mid-South. He also gained a lot of weight. The Junkyard Dog of the WWF was nowhere near the Junkyard Dog of Mid-South. So while he was probably the most popular black talent not only in the country, but maybe even the world. He pretty much did drugs and decided to screw himself over. And this was by the time it was even 1990. I think he was out of shape in like 1986, 1987. You know? Are you going to cut the Hogan run off to give it to the Junkyard Dog, who is not even in shape? I don't know. I don't think so. Then you have Butch Reed, the natural Butch Reed. Butch Reed was supposed to also be the first black Intercontinental Champion. The Honky Tonk Man got his run because Butch Reed skipped the date. In fact, that was his biggest problem. He skipped a lot of dates. This is something that when you look throughout history, Ultimate Warrior got fired for that. Ken Shamrock, was on the verge of getting fired for that. Skipping dates. So Butch Reed, who was also a favorite, was actually pegged to be the first black Intercontinental Champion, and then he skipped the date. And he said this out of his own mouth, by the way. So then you have two other top draws, Kamala and Abdullah the Butcher. Both of these guys, of course, are black. But they made more money traveling around the country, working with the top guys of the various territories than they probably would have ever made standing in one place. Abdullah the Butcher made a ton of money in Puerto Rico, ton of money in Japan. He probably would have had to take a pay cut to come work in the WWF. And Kamala, similarly, made a lot of money in the territories, wrestling guys like Andre the Giant and stuff like that. By the time you would have wanted to put the belt on Kamala, it was, you're talking about in the 90s maybe? Back when they did that silly thing with him slapping his belly and, he don't know how to pin people, like that goofy shit. And I can say that stuff was wrong, just like I talk about Saba Simba when we talk about Tony Atlas. But by then, you're talking about these guys whose the prime of their careers is already over. So you can't use Kamala or Abdullah the Butcher. Now, again, I'm not going to use every single black talent who came through WWE because not everybody is worthy of the conversation. Virgil, Coco Beware, Tuco Scorpio, they're not even worth talking about, all right? But Ahmed Johnson is. Vince loved Ahmed Johnson. Despite everybody saying that Ahmed Johnson sucked, Ahmed Johnson made good. He was the first black Intercontinental Champion. He seemed like he was going to be skyrocketed to the top. He was tag teaming with Shawn Michaels and Ultimate Warrior. Everything was working out great, and then he kept getting injured. And then he kept injuring other people. And people complained about his work. And then ultimately, he fucking quit. He quit the company. He walked out over what he said was a lynching storyline. Which, what happened was he was going to be carried out on a noose. Now, that part was true. He's going to have like a rope around his neck or something like that, and he's going to get dragged. And he said he quit because he didn't want his sister to see him get lynched on television. Well, he didn't get it because he quit. But, he wasn't going to get it anyway, if we're being honest. There was too many complaints about his work. He blew up way too quick. Even though Vince wanted him there for the popularity, it just wasn't going to click. Then obviously you have Ron Simmons, right? Ron Simmons was WCW World Champion. That's really one of the really reasons why his name even comes up in the conversation. But most people can't name one person Ron Simmons feuded with while he was the WCW Champion. And they don't know who he defended the belt against without Googling it. Ron Simmons, I hate to say this because I do like him. He was a token. He got the belt because WCW wanted to get the heat off of them about not having black people in certain positions in WCW. That's the only reason he was the champion. Yes, it was Bill Watts and Dusty Rhodes, and this is what they wanted to do, but the sole reason he was put in that position was to stave off a lawsuit. And it's unfair to him because I think he did a really good job. I even think the booking was solid, but the booking was racial. He did a storyline with Lex Luger saying that he wanted Ron Simmons to be his driver. Right? So Ron Simmons wasn't really, despite the fact that everybody likes him and he comes up in this conversation a lot, was he really going to be the guy? He wasn't even the guy when he was the guy. Then you got Mabel. Mabel's an interesting case. He's the first black WWF superstar to main event a major pay-per-view. And I'm not talking Lawrence Taylor and Mr. T because they're celebrities. He was the first black king of the ring and the first black talent to main event a pay-per-view. He wrestled Diesel at SummerSlam 1995. Mabel was the shits. He was terrible. All right? He was a terrible pro wrestler. He wasn't very good. And he was on drugs. Another one with the drugs. But they gave him the push at least. It was temporary, which is how he ended up, tied up with Undertaker for so long. But it might have been realistic, considering Yokozuna got it, but he wasn't as agile as Yoko. And heavens to Betsy, I don't remember a single Mabel promo ever. So then you got Mark Henry. Vince signed Mark Henry in 1995? Before he had even won a gold, or he didn't ever win a gold medal. When he was in the Olympics, he was sponsored by, powerlifting in the Olympics, and it took them over 10 years to get Mark Henry to a respectable level in the ring. Yes, he spent the entire Attitude Era being a kind of a jabroni and a jokester. Maybe if they'd have tried something like the Hall of Pain earlier, but again, Sexual Chocolate was Mark Henry's idea. It's something he wanted to do. And we all respect Mark Henry, but do you think Mark Henry should beat Stone Cold Steve Austin? No. Nope. Should he have beat like Mick Foley or Triple H? No. Nope. Not at that time. Not at that time. So then you would think I skipped somebody, so I just put them all as one character. The Godfather, and Papa Shango, all played by the same guy, Charles Wright. Charles Wright was just a mid-carder. He's a role player. I liked him too. I liked the Godfather too. I like Papa Shango a little bit more than the Godfather. He's just a role player. D'Lo Brown is one of the guys that I think is actually more underrated. I think D'Lo should have got a chance. I'm not saying he should have won it, but I'm saying we didn't even get to see D'Lo in that conversation. And sometimes it's okay to just be a mid-carder. But D'Lo is one of the guys where I would say, all right, he didn't even get a shot, and that's unfair. Okay. So then after D'Lo, you probably have, who's the next major black talent? Well, you got MVP himself. MVP quit WWF. He quit. He wanted out. He wanted to go wrestle in Japan. So they let him go wrestle in Japan. You have Bobby Lashley. Remember, Vince pushed Bobby Lashley right out of the gate. There's still people today talking about how, Heyman wanted CM Punk to win the Elimination Chamber that Lashley ended up winning because Vince made Lashley go over in that situation. Vince wrestled Lashley himself. Vince put Lashley in every position to succeed, put Lashley in the position to be his guy in the Donald Trump storyline, and Lashley quit. He quit. They fired his wife and then he quit. Okay? So that's just the reality. Lashley was in position. He quit. Shelton Benjamin, who was sitting right there on the stage with MVP, underutilized. Always felt Shelton Benjamin, much like D'Lo Brown, just didn't get the chance. Would have been nice. I can agree with you that Shelton Benjamin probably should have gotten the opportunity. Booker T, another situation where I felt like he should have gotten the opportunity. Not got the belt. When I say opportunity, I mean he got to wrestle for the belt, in very serious ways. I don't even think Booker T seriously even contended for the belt. But we end up in this situation where when it comes to Booker T and Mark Henry, where MVP says, well, they were the world champion. They weren't the WWE champion. It's like, well, Triple H was the world champion, and he main evented pay-per-views with that belt. He was the top guy with that belt. When Goldberg had it, that short time he had it, he was main eventing with that belt. When Shawn Michaels had it, the short time he had it, He was main eventing with that belt. Edge main evented a bunch of pay-per-views with that belt. Why is it now a lesser belt? Because Booker T and Mark Henry had it. Why would it be lesser at that point? So the next major black talents after Lashley and MVP would be guys who became the champion, Kofi and Big E. Both of them got the title. They got it. Xavier Woods didn't, but those two guys did. And now we're more into the modern day where, black guys are getting a lot more push and there's a lot more black guys to go around. So, sure, there's a couple of black guys there that I actually agree with you. And I can say, well, there probably just wasn't enough black talent on the roster, period. There was always one or two black guys on the roster. Never enough that you had a choice to make. And then some of the black guys on the roster, you just, what were you going to do? You really want me to sit here and say that Rich Swann or Virgil? Like, let's just get real. Certain people are just never going to make it. All right, 2 Cold Scorpio was never going to make it. He was on drugs anyway. Oh yeah, and Rich Swann, got accused of beating his wife. So if you want to have these conversations about every single black talent who came through WWE's doors, you end up in a very dark place. And then you have people that Vince tried to push, and they flamed out like Ezekiel Jackson. Vince tried, made him the Intercontinental Champion, made him ECW Champion. Nobody gave a fuck about that guy. Sometimes it's not that these guys aren't good enough. Sometimes the audience just doesn't care. Sometimes the audience don't believe them in that role. But that's why there should be more of them. Like, we're living in a really good spot right now where you got guys like Obafemi and Trick Williams and Javon Evans and Swerve all at one time. This wasn't the case when I was younger. I can say that. Wasn't a whole lot of main event black guys when I was younger. Black guys are mostly mid-carders, and you can see why they were mid-carders, even if you go back and look at the old footage. I don't think anybody's going to sit here and weep because Ice Train didn't become, world champion in WCW. Ranger Ross didn't get the belt. Oh my God, it must be racism. Nobody in their right mind thinks that. We think that when it should be a guy like Shelton Benjamin, when it should be a guy like D'Lo Brown who should get the chance. We say, oh man, it's probably race. But when it's certain other guys, we just like, yeah, he just ain't got it. But overall, though, I feel like these things should be addressed. And it's going to keep coming up. Nothing's going to change. Right? Because then they'll say, well, why did the black talent have to be so special? Why does Shawn Michaels was on drugs? Randy Orton did drugs. Like, yeah, but there's 100 of these fucking guys. You look at how many white guys are on the roster, and look at how many black guys are on the roster. That one black guy who decided to do drugs and not show up for work or something like that screwed up the entirety of black people being pushed for 5 or 10 fucking years. Even if Randy Orton screwed himself, it just moved to the next guy. Oh, Sean's going to do drugs. Okay, great. We'll just give it to Steve Austin. But if Ahmed Johnson fucks up and quits, then you'd have no more main event black guys. That's it. Oh, Butch Reed decided he was going to fuck off and disappear. Okay, now you have no main event black guys at all. That's the difference. That's why I started this by saying you probably should have recruited more black guys. Because it just wasn't enough to go around. You put too much pressure on each one of these guys out here. And that's the problem with the representation argument, is you force him to be perfect. It's not that the company is forcing him to be perfect. You're forcing him to be perfect. Because you're putting all the hopes and dreams of every black boy who watches pro wrestling on the shoulders of a guy who's got all kinds of problems of his own. He can't live your dreams. He can only do the best that he can. And then if he falls short, you just use his race as an excuse. It's like, no, we're not doing that. Anyway, I'll talk to you guys later.
Old non-aggression. Once that lesson sets in, you'll see a session. But you got an affection for no progression, regression. The best don't